Welcome back to Breaking Dawn. Now, the National Prosecuting Authority has announced that it will prosecute EFF leader Julius Malema's former business partners and co-accused for tender fraud amounting to over 60 million rand. But Malema himself will escape prosecution for now. The NPA said it will be pursuing charges against On Point Engineering, as well as the company's chief executive, Lesiba Kwangwa, and one of its directors, Kagiso Dichava. The charges relate to Limpopo Department of Roads and Transport's award tender worth almost 52 million rand. While the NPA has declined to prosecute Malema, the outcome of the case will be evaluated to determine if he should be prosecuted. Malema was and his business partners were charged with corruption, money laundering and racketeering in the Polokwane High Court, but the case was struck off the roll in 2015. AfriForum CEO Kali Kriel is a complainant in that particular case. We're joined now in studio by attorney and managing director David Akanistole, Incorporated Attorneys. David Akanistole is here to discuss this matter with us. David, good morning and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Caesar, and greetings to the viewers at home.
So, for somebody who's watching at home, right, they may not know Julius Malema's business associates, but they certainly know Julius Malema.
Yes.
And maybe if you're a layman, you understand, for example, how the law works, and you're asking, how is it that he's not getting prosecuted, whereas the other guys are? Can you explain that to us?
Yes. For the National Prosecuting Authority to make a decision on which persons to charge and which persons in respect of whom the prosecution must proceed or be initiated, they make an assessment whether the evidence that is before them, that has flown from the investigations that the police have engaged in, implicate. So if, for example, there is no evidence that implicates a particular individual, for example, in this case, the person of Julius Malema, then the National Prosecuting Authority will not proceed with the prosecution of that particular individual. And this is so because once a prosecution is initiated and the accused has pleaded, if the prosecution doesn't have sufficient evidence and that person is acquitted, there cannot be another prosecution that will flow from the same fact. So Mr. Julius Malema will get off the hook for the offenses which he may have in fact committed, but because the prosecution was initiated prematurely.
Okay. And so then if, for example, somebody had been charged and they let off the hook because of double jeopardy, you can never try them to charge them again.
No, if once you are acquitted, then you cannot be called upon to be prosecuted again, because that will amount to double jeopardy. You have faced that threat initially of being convicted and you were acquitted. So we cannot call you again and subject you to the same process. That will be an affront to the dictates of justice.
Mm. So in the matter of On Point Engineering, right, is there any evidence that links Julius Malema to the case, or was his name just thrown in there, for example, just for PR purposes?
Well, I've not assessed the evidence myself, but I assume that the National Prosecuting Authority has made an assessment and established that the evidence perhaps that's before it is not sufficient to secure a conviction, and has decided at this stage not to proceed with the prosecution of the person of Julius Malema. That can only be an assumption, but the National Prosecution Authority must be better placed to make an assessment and have the evidence that they need, because they know exactly the requirements or the requirements to set up a question of corruption case, for example, racketeering case. So once that assessment has been done and they've come to a conclusion that that is not sufficient, it's only them that obviously can make that decision at this stage.
Mm. Now, strategically, as a National Prosecuting Authority or as a prosecutor, you then can use one of the people who you do have sufficient evidence on to get them maybe to turn or even testify against another person that you're targeting. Is that correct?
Yes, there is that procedure. This is called the big fish principle. So, for example, if you are a small fish in the ocean, the prosecution authority may call upon yourself that you testify against a certain individual in exchange. So if you are to cooperate with the prosecution to implicate a certain individual who is considered a big fish in the ocean, then you may not be prosecuted if you can fully cooperate, even if that person is not eventually convicted, but you have cooperated, you have furnished all the necessary information that you are acquainted with. Then the prosecution authority can utilize you. Usually they use the small fish, as I've said.
Mm. And then in terms of, let's call it the suspense period in which the prosecutor can decide whether or not to bring charges against you, how long is that period?
Well, because the prosecution, it depends on the evidence that needs to be gathered. So if there's a lot of evidence that has to be gathered, obviously the prosecution must also indicate that they're in the process of investigating. They cannot leave the matter in limbo, hoping that something will come up. There must be positive actions to try to source evidence to implicate certain people. If there are, of course, allegations, which, of course, those allegations may not be well substantiated at that stage, then the prosecution authority must be able to exhibit that they are in the process of obtaining consultation with further potential witnesses and so forth, and, of course, engaging with the current persons who are already charged, whether or not they may be able to tend to be state witnesses in exchange for not being prosecuted and so forth and so forth. So they must play an active role. But at the same time, it's not the prosecution makes a determination who to prosecute and who not to prosecute. And they've got guidelines in this regard to make a determination whether they're going to prosecute certain persons or not. So it's not given that once an offense is reported and is reported to the police, brought to the prosecution authority, and in fact that may constitute an offense, that the prosecution authority is in fact going to proceed with the prosecution. That is not given. The prosecution makes a determination whether it is in the interest of justice to prosecute and so forth and so forth.
Thank you very much for joining us. David Akane Sisole, the good friend of the show's attorney and managing director at Akane David Sisole Incorporated Attorneys.